Is paper due tomorrow in class, or I think I do, that's done by class, so I think we do tell you.
Koi's on it. Correct. Yes, I sent an email. You can go check it out. It's okay. There's still time. Okay, we are going to get started for today. We do have quite a few learning objectives to get through, and evolution is a super important, very interesting, I think, personally, topic. So we do have two parts for our evolution lecture. Today is obviously part one, and then on Wednesday, we'll talk about part two, which is looking a bit more specifically at things like speciation, looking at some other examples as well. I do have this Sarah Anderson comic because it's amusing. So I was talking a little bit about dog domestication relative to artificial selection. And as I was mentioning, that happened about like 18-ish to 35-ish thousand years ago. But cats are semi-domesticated. And basically what that means is they probably had some version of like a commensal relationship with humans, as in they chose to kind of start hanging out around humans, mostly because there's probably more food, like maybe mice or other types of food scraps. So these papers that I have linked on here are about cat domestication, so you can go read them. But yeah, some research suggests this was actually probably just a commensal or even mutualistic relationship. So this is definitely much more recent as well, something like 4,000 years ago. So cats really have only been hanging out with humans for a short period of time. So kind of silly, kind of funny. I do have a warm-up for you all. I want you to get out a piece of scratch paper. You can share with a friend. That would be preferable, actually, because I don't want huge full sheets. So on a half sheet of paper, I want you to write down everything that comes to mind with the word evolution. Now, I don't want you to write down like what you think I want you to write down. When you hear this, what do you think of? Bullet points, pictures, whatever is fine. So just a couple of minutes here. Like I said, share a piece of paper with a partner is fine. Wow. And don't put your name on it. Keep it anonymous. Just write down what you think of when I say evolution. What do you think of? Yes, you're going to turn it into me. No, do not put your name on it.
Oh, it should be finished, at least to the point of. I would say.
Okay, we'll spend like one more minute here. So get your ideas written down. And again, you don't need to put your name on this. Keep your name off it, actually, please.
I'll write down.
You done? Foxes, dogs, and cats. Yeah, foxes. If nothing comes to mind, nothing at all, I'd honestly be shocked. Good. Yep, write something down. I'll give you one more minute here. Write some stuff down and then bring these up to me at the end of class. Yep, I'm going to look at them. It's not for a grade, just a casual, informal assessment. Okay, I think it looks like just about everybody is done with this, which is great. Like I said, bring this up to me at the end before you leave class. That would be great, please. So going into evolution, I do have this interesting video. I don't think I've linked it before. It's about 15 minutes, so it is fairly long relative to ones that I usually post. This is about ghost orchids and their specialized pollinators. This is a really, really awesome piece of filmmaking. It's beautiful. It's focused on the Everglades. If you're interested in any of those ideas at all, check it out. They're very devoted scientists and, like I said, filmmakers. So it's really cool. I recommend watching this. Yes. Yes, this is a funny, I think this is super amusing. So we can see here, this is kind of getting into some of our initial ideas. We have the seal. This is literally Darwin's head on a bird. We have the dodo with, not the dodo, we have a booby with the beard, the iguana, the Galapagos tortoise. So yes, these are Galapagos organisms shaped like Darwin. So for today, lots of different objectives. Some of these we will get to next class. Specifically today, we're going to be defining evolution. We're going to talk about the history of evolutionary thinking. We're going to talk about natural selection and how it shapes populations. We're probably not going to get to mechanisms, and then these other learning objectives on the bottom half of the slide are going to be addressed next class. So this slide should be a little bit of a review. Remember, genes are segments of DNA that have specific instructions to make proteins. And remember, alleles are versions of a gene. So in this example, we have two different versions of this gene, and they code for different phenotypes, which might be the darker moth or the lighter speckled moth. Now, this is something we haven't talked about before. The allele frequency, if you break down what that means, just using the allele, and then frequency is like what amount it occurs in. So what percentage of a population has a specific allele is our allele frequency. Now we know that humans, for example, we're diploid, we get two alleles, one from mom, one from dad, and that combination of alleles is what gives us our observable characteristics. Phenotypes are those observable characteristics. So that's what this last bullet is talking about here. The combination of inherited alleles leads to phenotypes. Questions here. This is mostly review. Okay. So getting started into what evolution is, because as promised, we're going to talk about kind of this definition. Evolution is a theory, and a lot of people think about theories as hunches or guesses, and they kind of get this vision of like chaos and something that doesn't have evidence. A lot of people use the word theory in casual conversation as a way of saying like to postulate or saying like, well, theoretically or in theory, kind of as a guess. But that is not at all what scientists mean when they say a theory. Scientific theories are not speculation at all. And there's lots of different examples of scientific theories, especially if you look at areas like physics and other things. There's lots of theories that basically are essentially similar to laws, but slightly different in that they're just, the definition is just slightly different. They have lots of evidence. There's no speculation. So I have an important definition here for you. A scientific theory is a hypothesis that has been supported by enormous amounts of data without evidence to the contrary. Now, something key about scientific theories is the fact that they are constantly able to be adjusted and modified with new data. That's a defining characteristic. So if new data is presented, the theory can be modified. Like any good hypothesis, we can reassess it when we get new information. However, scientific theories are those hypotheses that have really withstood the test of time, and lots of scientific studies have investigated their processes or their principles, and there's no contrarian evidence. Something else that's really cool about scientific theories is they have a lot of predictive power, which essentially means we can kind of use these ideas in order to think about what may happen under certain characteristics or under certain situations. So just to be clear, there's no scientific debate around the theory of evolution. And again, it is a scientific theory, which means there's a lot of predictive power and there's lots of evidence to support it. Getting more specifically into what evolution is, it's this unifying theory of biology. So essentially, it helps biologists ask and answer questions. And I have this quote here from this researcher who is a geneticist, and he says, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution," which is really true. And throughout the rest of the semester, and honestly, at the beginning of the semester, throughout this entire semester, I've shown you lots of different examples of organisms with interesting or unique adaptations, and all of those make more sense when we put them in this context of evolution. So this is absolutely true. It's a foundational theory, and it's critical to understanding biology. And a simple definition is changes over time. You'll notice if you read any sort of textbook or if you read any type of even just like a more casual source, they might define evolution differently. And I actually have 3 different evolution definitions in this PowerPoint alone, but all of them essentially revolve around this idea of changes over time. Now, more specifically, you might hear it as allele frequencies changing over time. And remember back to the previous slide, allele frequencies are basically like what combination of alleles we're seeing in a population. So evolution is changes over time, and it's a very important framework. Now I have an example maybe to make this idea a little bit more clear. So up here, I made this iguana figure. So this circle is representing the gene pool, which means organisms that are essentially in a population, they're able to interbreed, they're hanging out. And we see 2 distinct alleles. We have the yellow scale allele, which I'm telling you is dominant, to the white scale allele. Okay. So we could calculate the percentage of white scales, which I've done here for you. 6 out of these 14 iguanas gives us 43% of the population have this white allele. And then we could come up with the allele frequency, again, 43%. Now, the total frequency always equals 100. So I want you to, in your head or with a friend, tell them what the frequency is of the yellow allele. What is the alternative allele frequency? And we know there's only 2 alleles in this population. Everyone have it? What is it? Say it aloud. 57. Yeah, cool. Crush that mental math. Absolutely. So this is a really simplified example, but this is kind of the idea. Let's say this is our starting population, and a loggerhead shrike maybe is able to more easily see the white lizards from the habitat. So maybe I should have made this background all green, but let's pretend these white lizards stick out more than the yellow lizards. And over time, over multiple generations, so not just within one generation, maybe over lots of generations, the loggerhead shrike is selecting for the white lizards more often. Now, this is a type of bird. They live in Kansas and they do like to eat lizards. They actually impale their prey on things like barbed wire or thorns of plants, which is, I mean, kind of crazy, but they're really, really cool if you see them. So in this example, we can see a couple of key characteristics to kind of basic evolutionary theory. We have these selective factors. The environment that the lizards are in matters, and we're seeing a change from this allele frequency to this allele frequency. No, so I don't know why this picture is not showing up right away, but you can actually see, and this is a real picture. It looks kind of older, but this isn't like Photoshopped or anything. You can actually see them a lot of times in Kansas or in Oklahoma if you're driving along like highways. Sometimes you see also in like the desert in Arizona on like cactuses and things. If you ever see dead lizards hanging from them, it was probably a loggerhead shrike. And they have these really like stabby beaks as well. And they usually come back and eat the prey later, but sometimes like pieces of lizard carcasses remain. But yeah, they like grab the lizard and then stab it on the thorn to kill it. Yeah. Save it for later. It's kind of metal. It's really crazy. If you ever see it, it's cool. But anyways, back to evolution. Another really important definition that you might come across is this idea of descent with modification. And I broke that down for you in terms of what that kind of refers to. So descent in evolutionary vocabulary refers to shared ancestry, which essentially means like related organisms. And modification is referring to an accumulation of differences. Now the picture below is also of a real organism. These are super, super cool. Same deal. If you ever see these in person, you're very lucky. I've never seen one in like Malaysia, which is where they live, but these are orchid mantises, and you can see that they have really unique physical characteristics that allow them to blend in really well with the orchids that they live on. And this allows them to capture prey more easily because they're so well camouflaged here. So descent with modification, another really key evolution definition. Now this figure I love because I think it helps break some of these ideas down when we think about like what causes these similarities and differences among all the species we see. Now in this example, again, we're looking at an orchid mantis. We also have a leaf mantis and then one of these like stick mantids. And we can see they're all sharing this ancient common ancestor. Now we may or may not know what exactly this species is. And that's true of all evolutionary thinking is sometimes we know the common ancestor. Sometimes we've identified it in the fossil record, for example, but sometimes we don't. And it's just a hypothesized common ancestor based on shared characteristics. We know that it had to have existed, but we haven't maybe found it yet. A lot of times we don't actually know the exact common ancestor because certain types of tissue do not fossilize well. Ossified characteristics like bones, those do well surviving over time, but things like cartilage and other chitinous structures, so things made out of chitin like exoskeletons, like insects, for example, those don't get preserved very well. Leaf tissue, other types of like facial tissues and like skin, epidermis, that doesn't fossilize well. So sometimes there's challenges in finding or identifying these ancestors. Regardless, in this figure, we're seeing we have this common ancestor, and then based on different environmental characteristics, these mantids with their different adaptations are going to thrive in these environments, and over generations, we're going to see these adaptations, and this is a great example of this descent with modification. Some of the shared characteristics that all of these different mantids display are things like 6 legs, grasping forelimbs, large eyes. So those are characteristics that result from their shared ancestry, but this modification is what we see coming from different environments. Questions here so far? Okay, I do have a break, kind of like a thinking break. I want you to review gene expression with a partner or a group of partners. So I have some guiding questions here for you. What is gene expression? Why is it important? What are the main steps and what happens during those steps? So honestly, kind of a lot going on here. Work through this. You can be kind of broad, but I want you to think about this for a couple of minutes here. Maybe we should start with this first question really quick. What is gene expression? How genes are expressed. Cool. What are we looking at with that? Yes. Say what? Phenotype. So gene expression, remember, is how proteins are made. Remember, that's how proteins are essentially made. Okay, so use that and then work through the rest of this. Proteins are made via gene expression.
Well, it's kind of like how the ramification inform about how it's just looking at the DNA and making the protein based on that. So it's making the protein that is then shown. So it's looking at the genotype to make the protein.
Do you need more time here? Are you doing good? No? Done? Okay, so gene expression, I already talked about this with you all. It's essentially the process of how proteins are produced, right? Why is it important? Build proteins. Yeah, we do need proteins. Proteins serve lots of critical functions in living organisms, specifically things like maybe enzymes. Enzymes are really important. They're proteins. Okay, what are the main steps? Let's say there's two names I'm looking for here, like too broad. Sure. Translation, yeah, and Dom said transcription. And so if we flop those, we'd get them in order, right? We have transcription and translation. Cool. And during those steps, one of the first components is obviously the DNA has to be open, and then the DNA is essentially transcribed into what molecule? mRNA. Okay. And then what other piece of RNA is important? tRNA. And then we get our polypeptide chain, which is going to go on to be modified, folded up to reach its three-dimensional structure as a protein. Okay, if this is like, whoa, you have no idea what I'm talking about here, I strongly recommend that you start kind of integrating some more regular review. This is a good way of kind of making sure you can continue to refer back to important ideas. And again, working on concepts we've already kind of talked about in class and then studying them regularly is helpful for like exam performance, for example. So staying up to date so that way you're not like cramming later on. Any questions on this really broad overview of gene expression? Okay, if you have questions, as always, I have office hours after class today, and you can email me anytime. So getting into a little bit of the history, you've probably heard about Darwin, and some of you all might have even written that name down on your sheet when you think about evolution. However, he was not the first person to think or even talk about evolution, and it wasn't a new idea when he started working with it. Plato and other philosophers had mostly incorrect ideas. A lot of them thought that species were static and they remained unchanged forever across all of history. That said, that was definitely not correct, but it's, relevant to kind of the conversation. There was a geologist, Charles Lyell, who I have pictured on the screen, and he was working on essentially describing the way that the Earth's crust had formed via gradual geologic processes over time, and that had slowly shaped the surface over history. Now, his thinking on slow processes over time was really influential to Darwin's thinking about species kind of being modified over time. So Charles Lyell was a really important figure. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was a naturalist, and he thought that organisms changed over time based on use and disuse of certain characteristics. So essentially, like if you had feet but you didn't use them very often, those feet would just go away over time. That's kind of the idea that he thought of. Of course, everybody uses their feet, so that's a silly example. But he also thought that organisms progressed in a really linear fashion, which we know is not true. Evolution does not follow a linear set of steps. And Lamarck also thought that organisms had an inherent desire to become better, which again is a really big misconception in evolution. Organisms are not working to become better. They do not want to evolve, and they don't follow linear steps. They're usually in branching patterns, and it's as a result of environmental characteristics. That said, these scientists were really foundational to Darwin's work, and obviously we can see some ideas in their work that is similar to what Darwin was looking at. Now, you might have also heard of this. The HMS Beagle was a ship that traveled very widely, and the red line is the map of this ship's voyage. Now, Darwin, this is when he was a little bit younger. He's most commonly depicted with like the long white beard, and we actually have a cardboard cutout of him in the hallway. If you've seen it, it's kind of by my office. No, I don't know why we have that cutout, and honestly, I don't like it, but he was taller than that. He originally was supposed to be a doctor, and he studied he enrolled in college to study medicine. He didn't really like that very much. He had interest in history, so he was kind of just like seeing what he was into. He joined a naturalist on this voyage to go discover like broad lands. So you'll notice most of these places are areas that at the time in the 18th century were relatively foreign to Europeans. So they did leave Europe, and they were focusing mostly on like South America and parts of Africa as well. So the Beagle left in 1831, and it traveled for 5 years. So this was really quite a long voyage. And while he was on this journey helping the naturalists to kind of document some of these new, and I put quotation marks around new because they weren't new lands to the people who had been living there for generations. They were new to European ideas. But essentially they were documenting these new species, and he was compiling evidence on this journey for natural selection and his theory of natural selection. Now, when we think about the father of evolution, again, Charles Darwin typically comes to mind, but there's this other person, Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, really interestingly, they were both on different independent voyages, and they actually conceived the idea of natural selection independently. So these two scientists were thinking about these ideas at the same time and came up with the mechanism for evolution of the same mechanism at separate, kind of points, which I think is crazy. So here's a picture of Wallace. These were both naturalists. As I was saying, they were on these journeys. They were making observations, which is a really important part of science, frankly. Just writing down what you see, really comprehensive documentation is what allowed for a lot of these ideas. Now, something people don't know, as I said, they independently conceived and described the mechanism for evolution. Then they ended up writing letters to each other, and they actually published the paper on natural selection as a mechanism for evolution together. So most people haven't heard of Wallace, but he was really important as well. It's fairly likely that Darwin is so much more frequently cited with kind of the conceptualization of modern evolutionary theory for a couple of reasons. Number one, he cared a lot more about being in the public eye. He also wrote multiple books, so he was just a little bit more kind of within the common vernacular. Now, both of these scholars were looking in the tropics, and so we can think of the tropics as the birthplace of evolutionary thinking. Darwin was mostly in South America, like I said, a little bit of South Africa, Australia. Wallace was in Brazil and the Malay archipelago, which I have pictures of on the screen, and archipelagos are basically like islands connected. So we can see here in this map, we have the red indicating the tropical zone, and the tropics are incredible places because there's lots and lots of organisms that live there and tons of examples of coevolution. Now, coevolution is where multiple organisms, usually two, but it could be more, would be evolving together. And the example video I have at the beginning of class about the ghost orchid and its pollinator is a perfect example. That flower basically has a component on it that's super duper long, and then this is like the normal flower. And to pollinate this flower, the ghost orchid, there's a specific moth that has a proboscis basically identical to the shape of the flower. So this is a perfect example of coevolution. And again, you should watch the video, it's cool. But the tropics have lots and lots of examples of coevolution. Some other weird fun facts, mostly because I think it's interesting, so I think you all might as well. Darwin was known for regularly seeking out and consuming the creatures he came in contact with. One of the things that was driving his interest to visiting all of these places was because he wanted to eat, quote, every animal he ever studied. Now, that's probably not true. That's probably a bit fictitious, but he certainly spent a lot of time eating and documenting the flavor of these different organisms. Now we have a puma, of course, an armadillo. The ray is like a South American ostrich. Galapagos giant tortoises, you definitely shouldn't be eating these. Definitely should not do that. Here is a Galapagos tortoise relative to a horse. Well, now they're critically endangered, so yeah. Probably not ever fine. Tortoises and turtles in general are super long-lived, so like hundreds of years, and they don't have a ton of offspring. So really long generation time animals are just more endangered in general. Like they're less capable of reproducing. So if you eat a lot of them, for example, their population diminishes. And then the swimming iguanas are crazy. They do have the capacity to swim in salt water. And so he actually ate all of these creatures. He was also really bad at boating. He was very seasick all the time, which if you think about being on a boat for 5 years, that's sounds pretty terrible to me. But one last kind of weird piece of biology lore. There's a classic tradition in biology and ecology to eat your study species. So lots of ecologists have actually consumed the organisms that they study, even if they're weird. And some people think that this kind of might have originated with Darwin's whole eating everything he studied. But yeah, some interesting lore there for you. Now, a couple more important notes about Darwin. Although he was an important scientist and his contributions were really impactful to kind of modern evolutionary theory, he had extremely problematic views and made lots of very racist remarks about human evolution and humans in general. He touched on eugenics ideas. So we were recently talking about ethics in science, and we do have to place these ideas as well in context. So I have some quotes here that are very disturbing from one of his most widely publicized book on the descent of man. So he also thought women were inferior to men and said they had smaller brain cavities and smaller brains, et cetera, et cetera. So Darwin had some important contributions, but he's also made some seriously problematic and harmful remarks about other biology topics. So it's important to kind of consider both of these components. Focusing on portions of the narrative that are often left out, there was this man, John Edmonstone, who was born in Guyana, South America, and he was a really, really talented naturalist and actually taught Darwin how to prep specimen. So specimen are essentially kept in museums, and basically they're skins or pelts. They can be fur, they might be bones, they might be other types of tissues and things. And John Edmonstone was this man who helped Darwin actually preserve these organisms and document these discoveries. He was originally an enslaved man and then was brought to Scotland where he was freed, which was really how he was able to go help Darwin. So again, he was a very, very important contributor to evolutionary discoveries, and a lot of times people have never even heard of this man. So if you want to, you can go read this article about him. And sadly, like a lot of folks in history, we don't know a ton of details, but that article talks a lot about what we do know. So kind of concluding this idea here about Darwin's influence on natural selection, we know that individuals in a population vary from one another. So this was one of his main conclusions. So we see variation in a population, which is probably something that you all have either consciously or unconsciously observed. When you see populations of things, you can see variation. We also know parents pass characteristics to their offspring. And interestingly, Darwin was working on these ideas around the same time as Mendel, and they didn't really know how their two kind of frameworks worked together. So that's something also kind of interesting, because Darwin was working on these really big ideas and Mendel was working on those specific like inheritance patterns, and those were really, of course, formative ideas in biology. Another important component to natural selection is the fact that more offspring are produced than can survive. Simply put, there are not enough resources for all organisms anywhere ever. So there is going to be death in a population. Now, this unequal ability to survive and reproduce leads essentially to this accumulation of favorable traits in a population over generations. There's kind of a lot of big words here, but this is so key to understanding this mechanism of evolution. So some organisms are going to survive and reproduce, and the ones that do that, we expect to be those that have favorable traits for the given conditions. Does that make sense? So the unequal ability to survive and reproduce is super key to evolution. Now, lastly, individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability to survive will have more offspring than those without those favorable traits. Now, I do also have this figure on the screen, which is kind of like a weird swirly situation, but I put the star on the population of fish because this is so important to remember. Evolution works on the population level. Evolution is never working in an individual. It's always in populations. This scope is critical. So evolution, like an individual can't evolve. I can't evolve. A single fish is not evolving. Populations evolve, and that's the smallest scale. Questions here? Okay, I have a fun break here for you. Share with a friend. What is the best part about spring? I have some examples of my favorite parts about spring. But tell a friend, what's your favorite part of spring? The pear trees.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to share? What's your favorite part about spring? The smell. Yeah, it smells pretty nice. If you have allergies, it can be a bit of a pickle, but yes, it smells nice. See what? The weather. Absolutely. Yeah. Anything else that I missed? Flowers start blooming. Yeah, I have the crocus up here. I love when they bring the ducklings to Tractor Supply. I wish they would let me pet them, but sadly they don't. No, I don't think they have them yet, but they bring them in spring, and I like that. I think they still do, usually. If you're a herpetologist, spring is a great time to go find snakes. This is a really cute, I can't think of its common name right now, Didophis punctatus. This is a ringneck snake. They're very friendly, very small. You should go find them. They're very cute. Where would you find one? The Sternberg Nature Trails are a great place to find one. If you flip rocks or if you flip like small pieces of metal or anything you find in the area, they're very cute. They're very friendly. Yeah, I mean, their mouths are like this big. They couldn't bite you even if they wanted to. And they're super cool. Their bellies are bright red and they're about like this big. They're cute. You should go see them. They're good. That's a great question. It technically is illegal to pick them up without a hunting license. But if you have a hunting license, you can pick up herps. No, but I have a scientific collection permit, which allows me to pursue herps and collect them. Yeah, you need a hunting license to pick up a turtle, a snake, a lizard, a frog, any of those. Kicking them out of the way. Yeah, technically you still need it. You also need a hunting license to kill animals. It varies on a state-by-state basis. Yeah. So Kansas is specifically like that. Missouri has different regulations, and Oklahoma is a lot more lax. So I'm pretty sure in Oklahoma, you actually don't even need the permit. Yeah, Oklahoma's kind of crazy. Like they only have like one listed species. Yeah. Okay. Are you ready to keep talking about evolution? Okay, also monarch migrations. If you see the cool monarch butterflies, Kansas is part of the Central Flyway, which is where they come through, which is really cool because a lot of states actually don't see monarchs. So like in Colorado, we don't get very many because they don't fly through there as much. But here they come through a lot, which is why milkweed is super important in Kansas. So, okay, we're going to keep going. In evolution, as we were talking about, natural selection is what we refer to as a mechanism for evolution. So this is a key kind of idea here. Evolution is our broad unifying theory. It's our broad idea. And there's various mechanisms for how evolution occurs. So evolution is change in populations over time. And natural selection is one of the most predominant ways that these populations change. So this is a mechanism for how this change occurs. This is also the most common, the most widely known, and it's also the mechanism that Wallace and Darwin described. Now, the environmental conditions essentially dictate which organisms are going to survive and reproduce. And organisms better suited for a given environment are those with greater fitness. Okay, so if the environmental conditions change, we would expect to see different selection, essentially different selection for specific traits. So lots of really important ideas here. Now, I have this keyword as well. Organisms that are more adapted or better well suited for an environment are those with greater fitness. Now, a lot of times when you say the word fitness, you think of like how many reps you can do at the gym or like working out to get gains, but that's not what we mean in evolutionary theory. This just refers to the number of offspring and the number of like grand offspring and great grand offspring. So how many future generations are you contributing your genetic information to? Fitness is how we measure survival and reproductive success. And this is so important. Organisms do not survive because they're fit. That's not true at all. We don't see survival because of fitness. Organisms might be better adapted for an environment and therefore have greater fitness, but they don't survive because of fitness. Does that make sense to everybody? So this like colloquial use of the word fitness, scrape it from your brain for the next rest of your life, frankly, but especially for the exam. Now, you might have heard of this before. Evolution or natural selection is survival of the fittest. If you've heard this, I want you, again, get this out of your brain. This is scientifically not accurate. I know, sorry. It's okay. If you wrote this down, it's totally okay. It's a really common misconception. And if you must continue to think of natural selection or evolution as survival of the fittest, remember what fitness actually means. So remind me again, what is fitness? Number of offspring. Yeah, so sure, we could say organisms that have greater fitness are going to have an advantage. So sure, fine. Now, in this figure, I want you to tell me which of these birds has higher fitness? This bird? Yay, good job. It's a really easy example. So remember, fitness just to measure children, great-grandchildren. Okay. So going now a little bit into the evidence for evolution, within each of these broad categories, there's lots of interesting examples. And if you want me to send you some, I'd be more than happy to send you information or additional articles or alternative examples as well. So one of the most important pieces of evidence for evolution is just primary data, which we see in the fossil record. This shows what was alive and when. And basically, this is just physical evidence most of the time of what organisms looked like in the past and how they relate to each other. This is also really key to understanding the fact that the organisms that are alive today are different from what was alive previously. And I have a picture of horse evolution on here because this is one of the most successful fossil records that we have. It's highly branched, this tree, and we've actually been able to track both tooth and toe structure. And again, you can see this idea of a branching pattern of evolution. And horse fossils, we just have a lot of them, and they're a good fossil record. So lots of interesting information about horse ancestors. There's actually over 100 extinct species that they found, and it is from 5 different continents, I believe. So lots of common ancestors they found here. Again, this is showing evidence of similarities in fossils. So as seen in this example, we're looking at cetaceans, which are essentially like sea animals, and then their close relationship to even-toed ungulates, also relative to other mammals. So we're looking at specific characteristics that are being pointed to here with the arrows. We can see similarities in the cetaceans and even-toed ungulates in this bottom projection. So you'll notice here we have kind of 2 projections, whereas in most other mammals, we have this different characteristic of just the single projection. So earlier mammals had this double kind of point, and later mammals did not. So again, good example of evolution. And if you want to read more about fossils or this specific example, let me know. There's a lot of jargon that I'm not trying to like weigh your brains down with, but if you want to read about this, there's a specific name for this bone. It's the ankle bone is what we're looking at here, by the way. Another good piece of evidence for evolution are with other anatomical structures, so either homologous structures, and if we break down this word, homo again means similar, so similar structures. Now these are structures in different species that have the same construction. Extremely common example is with like finger or phalange bones in different types of organisms. So you can see up here we have this orange color highlighting these similar anatomical features across a wide variety of different vertebrate organisms. We also have vestigial structures as good evidence for evolution. These are basically structures that an organism carries with them, but that don't serve a function. There are some debates in terms of like what vestigial structures might exist with humans. Some people say wisdom teeth are a vestigial structure. Some of you might not even have wisdom teeth. I had to get mine ripped out, but we see those kind of varying in a population. Yeah. Yeah, there's some variation on that definition as well. So either it doesn't serve the original function or it doesn't really serve a function in the current edition of the organism. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, the idea with wisdom teeth, for example, is they used to be pertinent to like serious grinding and like greater jaw capacity, but we don't need that anymore with like cooking and softer foods and things. Yeah. The appendix. Yeah, that's a great question. So I had a question about the appendix. This is awesome. For a long time, people cited the appendix as a vestigial structure, but we know it's actually critical to the health and the functioning of humans, and it actually provides important microbiome components. That's a good question. I don't know if it was used to help with digesting bark, but it has always contributed to like gut, either like digestion or the flora. You can survive without. Yeah, you can survive without your appendix, but you have to sometimes take like capsules of human feces in order to maintain your specific capacity. So kind of interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. If you don't know about that, it is interesting. It's also like you can survive without a kidney, but you do need both, ideally. But yeah, there's some good examples here. A common example not in humans would be like wings on a flightless bird. What are flightless birds doing with wings? You know, it's just evidence. Flying. They're not flying, they're flightless. This is just another example of homologies. So again, homologies are similar characteristics that result from shared ancestry. So on here, and I'm not asking you to assess phylogenies right now, but you can see some of these key branching points. And on this tree, each of these numbers is representing a common ancestor, and these lines are showing the characteristic that all of these other organisms share. The other fun fact for the day, birds are technically reptiles. So in case you didn't know that, now you do. That's what also is being shown on this tree. Now I'm kind of speeding through this just so I can make sure we get to the end of today's class. But another interesting piece of evolution is essentially the distribution, the geographic distribution of organisms on the planet. They follow patterns that can best be explained based on geologic history. So we know that throughout history, there's been different kind of permutations of the ways that the Earth's, and by Earth, yeah, the Earth's land masses have been either connected or disconnected. We see some species that are continentally kind of dispersed, which means they exist everywhere. And we see other organisms, for example, marsupials in Australia, that are basically dated back to the time when that landmass was splitting off. So this is a good piece of evidence for evolution. Questions here? Now, the last interesting piece of evolution that we're going to be talking about today, and again, there's lots of other examples that we could talk about. Has anyone heard of MRSA? You probably heard like, okay, you don't want to get MRSA, which is definitely true. MRSA is referring to methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which basically means it's a bacteria that is resistant to methicillin, which is an antibiotic. Now, Staphylococcus aureus exists all over. Some forms are not pathogenic, which means some forms don't cause disease in humans, but some forms do. And back in 1943, penicillin was introduced, and partly to treat these staph infections. However, we saw that over time, these staph infections were no longer being treated by penicillin. So in just a few short years, 2 years, this is crazy. In 2 years, 20% of these staph strains were resistant to penicillin. Then researchers were like, okay, we need something else to treat these staph infections. Let's get methicillin in there. Now we know that there's lots of different type of staph bacteria that are resistant to both penicillin and methicillin, which is what make them MRSA. So then they're resistant to this cocktail. Now, MRSA spread, and for a while we were able to control it by a combination of other antibiotics, and now we don't really have that capacity. MRSA is really, really deadly because it's extremely hard to treat. This isn't like super doom and gloom. We do know that researchers are developing new antibiotics to treat this, but the number of new undiscovered antibiotics is seriously dwindling. There was a big boom in the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc. of new antibiotics, but the number of new antibiotics that we still have is not that many. So this is kind of a haunting example of how evolution can be really impactful in like modern times. So I think that's time. But yes, if you have questions, let me know. I'm happy to chat. So have a good Monday. Yes, bring me your evolution papers. You can just make a pile on the corner of the desk. Would be great.